Wow. Welcome to our Cox Center annual fall conference. This one, I think, is the most timely and most important one the law school has ever had. International law in the new Cold War, looking at the issues related to the Russian, I almost said Soviet, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And, you're going to hear more about this today, but this stuff is changing every day. The fact that the Russians are currently engaged in a referendum to have a plebiscite where the people in the eastern regions will vote to merge with Russia, and then when the Ukraine government tries to retake their territory, Russia will say that is an invasion and will up the ante. This is all happening in real time. The fact that the Russians have just mobilized 300,000 more people, reinstituting a draft, first time since World War II, this is all happening in real time. The fact that the Russians are saying that anything goes, including nuclear weapons. This is the first time in 60 years any country has ever said that. This is all happening in real time. So that's the reason we're all here today, and it's going to be an exciting and important conference. I'm Michael Scharf. I should have started with that. I'm the co-dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I've had this position now for 9 years, which is like at least 5 years longer than I would have thought, and I just got another 5-year renewal, so who knows? But anyway, the law school has really been doing some exciting stuff in international law, and on each of your tables we do have the Case Global magazine that gives you an update. Some of the highlights include one of our 1Ls who did Jessup last year. Our team made it to the international rounds, and she was ranked best speaker in the whole world out of 2,400 people. So that was pretty cool. The law school, according to the Pre-Law magazine rankings, is one of the top 9 international law programs in the country. We all knew that to be the case, but it's nice to get that kind of recognition. And it brings in more and more students, as you're going to be meeting today, that come here with an interest in international law. In fact, I would say our law school is sort of like the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of law schools, and about 40% of our students come for our international law program. What we find sometimes is people say, oh yeah, you've got this great program where you give everybody internships all over the world and you pay for it out of your endowment, but are they getting jobs? And so in the Case Global magazine, you're going to see a list of our alums and where they're working in the international law field. It's quite impressive. It's not a complete list. These are just people who volunteer to help our students network and start their careers. In addition to that, we have a Yemen accountability project, which some of you have heard about in the past. We're doing major work to document the atrocities in Yemen. That's not the forgotten war. What's going on in Yemen is horrible and needs to stay on the front pages as well. And the law school, continues to do major lectures and conferences, and we're real excited about this one. In addition, I have been under the tutelage of Layla Sadat, the president of the American branch of the International Law Association, for the last 2 years as president-elect, and she is finishing her 4-year term as president and becoming chairman of the board. And she has dedicated this conference to be the American branch of the International Law Association's International Law Weekend Midwest, which is a really important designation for us. So I'd like to call Layla up to say a few words about the section and help me kick things off today. Layla.
Thank you so much. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief because I know we're all waiting for the main events. It's a pleasure to be back at Case and in this really beautiful space. It's very, very inspiring to be in a space like this, to take on the difficult questions, and to think beyond the possible, which I love as a mantra. As president of the International Law Association we do say American branch, but it should be for the United States. We're thinking about that. I have had the honor to be president-elect for 2 years and then serve as president for 4. And your own Dean Scharf is going to be taking over as president on October 22nd, not that I'm counting the days. And one of the key things that we do is we try to sponsor conferences around the United States, in addition to liaising with the 63 branches of the ILA abroad. I encourage anybody who's not a member to join. It's very inexpensive, and it does immediately catapult you into a global network with close to 5,000 members in branches all over the world. The primary work that we do is through our committee structure, which is a little unusual. We have committees on a variety of topics, including the International Criminal Court, the use of force, rising sea levels, all kinds of different customary international law. And ILA reports at the international level, because they are globally staffed, are often taken up by the International Law Commission or other United Nations bodies when thinking about the content of international law. At the American branch level, our local committees, chaired by many of the people in this room actually, are very active and conduct a wide variety of activities. Our other important activity is conferences like this, and I've always been so impressed by Case Western under Michael's leadership especially, but even when you weren't Dean, Michael, Michael was really instrumental in sort of bringing international law to the Midwest. And the slogan that I adopted when I became president of ABILA, as we call it, was international law now more than ever. And this was even before we had an invasion of Ukraine, because you could already see that rising sea levels, migration, instability around the world were all contributing to a destabilizing of the liberal international legal order. We've seen a rise of autocracies. We've seen protests in the Czech Republic. We're starting to see food shortages, migration, a huge hurricane in Florida, which everybody says, of course, was due to rising sea levels and climate change. And we have a series of global crises that need really good advocates and thinkers and individuals who can dream about what is possible even in the face of all of this. I like to stay an optimist. You couldn't do the kind of work that I've been doing for a long time with the International Criminal Court without having hope in humanity's future. I have great hope in the future of humanity, especially when I look at the young people who are here, the wonderful students that Dean Scharf has just spoken about, because they really are our future, which is why a conference like this in the Midwest, not a region known for its global outlook, is so important, because every person on the planet is literally implicated by all of these crises. If you enjoyed this meeting, please do join ABILA and come to International Law Weekend in New York in 2022, October 20th through 22nd. We will celebrate our 100th anniversary as a society. And when I did some research on what makes an organization live for 100 years, it is easy to see why ABILA has survived. It's a commitment to service, it's a public ethos, it's individuals who give of their time and treasure to support the organization, and it's a sense of mission. And for us, the mission really is international law. We need it now more than ever. So thank you so much, everybody. I really, really are grateful to be here. And Michael, I wish you a fabulous conference and look forward to the deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. So Layla was mentioning our students. I do want to do a shout out to two of them that are right in front of us. The symposium editor that helped put all this together and has really made sure that all the speakers got us their papers in time to be published in the spring. And as you know, as sitting in front of you guys, this is the volume from last year's conference. And every spring we do a volume like that. It's a big book, and that's edited by our students. So the symposium editor is Gabe Kaufman. And then the editor-in-chief sitting next to Gabe is Emma. And so these guys do such a great job. And where are all the other students that are in the International Law Journal? You guys are all outside. So you'll see them, thank them for all that they do. And next year, if you come back, we'll have another volume like that. Because of the Cox Center, we actually send a copy of that volume to 1,400 professors of international law every summer. And our Environmental Law Center thinks this is a horrible thing because we're killing a lot of trees, but it does seem to work because we're among the top most cited journals in the country. And I do believe that it's in part because of the content and in part because it comes to them for free every summer. So thank you guys very much for all that you do. We have one other item of business before the keynote address. So Milena Stereo is now the president of the International Association of Penal Law. The past president is Michael Kelly, and he is the chair of their book award. And Milena and Michael asked for a minute because we traditionally give those book awards at this conference. So Mike, if you want to come on up.
Well, since everything always sounds better in French, l'Association Internationale de Droit Pénal is a society of international criminal law jurists and scholars founded in 1924 in Paris, where it's still headquartered. I have the honor of serving on the board of directors. We have had consultative status originally with the League of Nations and now enjoy that status with the United Nations. The American branch of AIDP every year awards a book award for the best book of the year. And this year it goes to, and I've got the plaques here, The Syrian Conflict's Impact on International Law by Paul Williams, Michael Scharf, and Milena Stereo. So if you all three could come up and receive your awards.
Do we have anybody who could just snap a picture while we're up here? We don't have oh, there's our photographer. Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. You guys
Congratulations.
to the side?
Come on in. Yeah.
You can be, well, there we go. You can stay, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's just great.
Yep.
So, thank you, Mike.
Congratulations.
Thanks. You know, yeah, so now I'm going to be known as the guy who books his own band for the conference, and then instead of party favors, he gets book awards. Sorry, but thank you, Mike. That's really wonderful news. And there is a copy of that book and several others that have been written by the folks in this conference out there for you to look at. And then Paul Williams' new book. There are free volumes out there for you to scoop up, and there's only about 12 of them. So first come, first serve. It's a really great book. All right, now, the big event of the morning, and that is our keynote speech. We are really fortunate to have returning to us Sean Murphy. Let me tell you a little bit about Sean as he comes up this way. So I've been fortunate to have mentors that have been outstanding, including Layla, as I mentioned, at the American branch. But when I got to the State Department 30 years ago, Sean Murphy was a senior, more senior than me, attorney advisor, and took me and Paul Williams and others under his wing because even then he was a great teacher. He left the State Department to become a professor at GW. He had this amazing career on the side where he was arguing cases before the International Court of Justice, arbitration cases at the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. He became the American member of the International Law Commission. And in that capacity, he took on the role of taking Layla Sadat's idea that she had created through academic conferences of a treaty on crimes against humanity and turned it into reality. And that's no small feat to birth a treaty. He was on the short list to be the next American judge on the International Court of Justice, and a lot of people I know were really cheering for him because he would be amazing in that role and every role that he ever takes. Today, his role is going to be to kick things off at our conference. Sean, thank you. Oh, and I will mention one other thing. He was the recipient of our award for advancing global legal studies. It's called Cleveland's Nobel Peace Prize. And this afternoon, you'll hear more about that award and this year's recipient. But Sean, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michael. Well, first of all, thanks very much, Michael, Dean Scharf, for that lovely introduction. And my thanks as well to the Case Western Reserve Law School and the International Law Association American Branch Midwest for the invitation to be here today. It really is a great a pleasure. So the title of the conference is International Law and the New Cold War. And there are, I think, at least 3 propositions in that title. The first is that there's something new that has happened to which we should pay attention. The second proposition is that what is new is a Cold War that did not previously exist or that ceased to exist for a period of time. The conference title actually does not indicate between or among whom that Cold War exists, but the description of the conference and our first panel for today, and Michael's introductory remarks, suggest that it does have something to do with the Ukraine crisis. So perhaps we're talking about a new Cold War between the United States and Russia and their respective allies. The third proposition is that this unspecified but new Cold War has something to do with international law, which merits our spending a day working through certain legal issues. So, in the next 30 minutes, I thought I would deconstruct those 3 propositions a bit and see where it takes us as a prelude to the discussions that will follow over the course of the day. So let's start with the first of the 3 propositions, that there's something new that has happened to which we should pay attention. Well, one thing that's new and that probably triggered the focus of this conference is that on February 24th of this year, the Russian Federation launched widespread missile attacks and airstrikes across its neighboring country of Ukraine, including the capital of Kyiv, followed by a ground invasion from multiple directions. This unprovoked attack has caused the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II, with 1/3 of the Ukrainian population displaced and some 7.3 million Ukrainians fleeing abroad. The invasion has been widely condemned by other countries, which have imposed extensive economic sanctions on Russia, on its leaders, on its financial elites. Meeting in an emergency session and pursuant to the Uniting for Peace resolution, the UN General Assembly, by a vote of 141 to 5, deplored Russia's aggression, they used that term, aggression, and demanded the complete and unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops. Further, the General Assembly suspended Russia's membership in the UN Human Rights Council. Upon the filing of a case by Ukraine against Russia, the International Court of Justice ordered Russia to suspend immediately its military operations. The Council of Europe expelled Russia. For its part, the International Criminal Court has opened an investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity committed as a part of the invasion. The 45 member states of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe invoked their mechanism, ironically known as the Moscow Mechanism, to create an independent fact-finding mission, which is documenting Russian abuses of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Human Rights Council has established an independent international commission of inquiry on Ukraine charged with investigating such violations. While these facts are new and may suggest the emergence of an East-West conflict that did not previously exist, we should recall that Russia first invaded Ukraine 8 years ago, in February of 2014, when Russian troops captured strategic sites across Crimea. Russia then installed a pro-Russian government there, which proceeded to hold a referendum, declare independence, and then seek and receive annexation by Russia. Following that annexation, Russia escalated its military presence in the Crimea, but it also did so in the eastern part of Ukraine, known as the Donbas region. And like today, in 2014, other countries also condemned Russia's actions, leading to Russia's suspension from the group of G8, the imposition of economic sanctions, and, for example, a UN General Assembly resolution rejecting the referendum and annexation and reaffirming Ukraine's territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. So perhaps Russia's actions of today are not quite as new as they feel. Indeed, one might also hearken back to Russia's military operations in Georgia in 2008, where the armed conflict displaced about 200,000 people and led to the breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which declared themselves independent states. Last year, the European Court of Human Rights found that Russia had maintained direct control over those regions after the active phase of hostilities and was responsible for grave human rights abuses that occurred there. This year, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for several Russians alleging their commission of war crimes against ethnic Georgians. I mention all of this as a prelude to noting that the idea of a Cold War of the United States and Russia is not exactly new. Even before Russia's intervention in Georgia, Mark McKinnon wrote a book in 2007 entitled The New Cold War, to be followed in 2008 by Edward Lucas's book of the same name. The chorus only strengthened over time, perhaps especially in the wake of the events in Crimea. But the origins of such claims probably lie dominantly in the rise to power of Russian President Vladimir Putin more than 2 decades ago, in 2000, and Russia's turn away from the democratic reforms and new freedoms that were a hallmark of Russia during the 1990s in the immediate aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Perhaps what is new is not so much developments with respect to Russia, but rather those relating to the People's Republic of China. Hal Brands and John Lewis Gaddis, writing last year in Foreign Affairs magazine, regarded it as a given that the United States and China have entered into a new Cold War, which those authors understood to mean a protracted international rivalry. They did not make the case that this is new in the sense of the last few years. They argue that the United States and China were tacit allies during the second half of the prior Cold War, and that now things are different, a likely protracted rivalry having emerged. As with Russia, this seems to have a lot to do with the assumption of power by a particular person, in this case, President Xi Jinping, who has de-emphasized the pro-market reforms of his predecessor, focusing instead on tight control of dissent and information, including through the internet, the flouting of international legal norms, such as in relation to the South China Sea, and the pursuit of aggressive diplomacy. Add to this that China has experienced extraordinary economic and military growth in recent years. It now has the largest active military and the largest navy in the world, so that many view it as rivaling US power. Again, though, the newness of this Cold War can also be questioned. Yes, China is taking threatening steps vis-a-vis Taiwan, but we might recall that China splashed missiles off the coast of Taiwan in 1995 to 1996, during the supposed golden period of a new world order. And moreover, Taiwan has always been a flashpoint in US-Chinese relations. Yes, China flouted the 2016 arbitral decision relating to the South China Sea, which rejected China's 9-dash line, but recall that an early version of that line dates back to 1948 and was actually issued by the authorities on Taiwan, not in Beijing. Thus, when pondering newness, it's apt to observe that history rarely unfolds in a binary fashion of continuity versus change. Usually it's about both forces happening simultaneously. But let's assume that something new is going on, at least in the sense of a perceived change since the 1990s. Is what is new a Cold War with Russia, or a Cold War with China, or maybe a Cold War with the two of them together? Well, much turns on what we mean by a Cold War. Presumably it has something to do with two or a few major powers representing different ideologies that are engaged not in direct conflict, but in colder proxy wars and other struggles worldwide in an effort to gain hegemonic influence. With respect to Russia, the first observation might be that there is nothing cold about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, either in Crimea in 2014 or more broadly in 2022. Since February of this year, Russia is estimated to have suffered in Ukraine 70 to 80,000 military casualties. And obviously the Ukrainian military and its civilian population are being directly injured by Russia's conduct. The same lack of coldness was observed in the Donbas region since 2014 and in Georgia in 2008. One can only call these proxy wars by essentially redefining that term. Yet beyond that observation, the reality is that Russia is no longer the major economic or military power that it was during the Cold War that ended in 1990. At the end of the Cold War, the Soviet bloc represented about 9% of the total global population and 10.5% of the global economy, measured at purchasing power parity. Today, Russia and its few allies reflect about 2.5% of total global population and about 3.5% of the global economy. Russia's diminished military power has been on display in Ukraine. Not only was Russia unable to quickly subdue Ukraine after its initial invasion, but by April it was forced into a strategic repositioning of all of its troops into the eastern part of Ukraine. Further, Ukraine has now gone on the offensive, reclaiming some 8,000 square kilometers of its territory so far this month, a development that some are likening to America's victory over Britain at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. This in turn led President Putin to announce, as Dean Scharf noted, a mobilization last week that would sweep some 300,000 Russian civilians into its military service, a step that has prompted many military-aged men to flee the country and led to protests and detentions across Russia. President Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons and the staging of sham referendums and annexations in occupied territories strike many as signs of weakness, not of strength. leaving aside that there's nothing cold about this war and that Russia is far from the power that it was that characterized the Soviet Union, we could further ask whether this is really an East-West conflict. Certainly, massive economic sanctions have been imposed on Russia, most notably by Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And further, many Western nations have sent much-needed weapons to Ukraine. So perhaps that's suggestive of an East-West divide. But who constitutes the East in this scenario? Russia doesn't have any significant allies, as it did during the former Cold War. Rather, it's experiencing fairly broad global isolation. Obviously, Ukraine, a staunch ally during the Cold War, is not now standing by Russia. And who are the countries intervening on Ukraine's behalf at the International Court of Justice? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, the list can go on. We used to regard those countries as part of a Warsaw Pact, a counterbalance to NATO, but those days are long gone. Even North Korea felt compelled to issue a press release denying that it was selling weapons or ammunition to Russia. Meanwhile, Finland and Sweden, which throughout the Cold War sought to sail between the East and the West, have now jumped ship and are swimming rather quickly towards NATO. In short, this is far from our parents' Cold War, if it's a Cold War at all. Even China and India have recently given Russia very negative signals, with Prime Minister Modi telling Putin, today's era is not of war. Is there instead a Cold War with China? Well, the growth of China's military has been impressive, but given Russia's experience in Ukraine, one wonders whether China's military might also be the victim of an opaque command system, endemic corruption, and low-quality recruits. Further, while there's no doubt that China is exerting itself as an economic power worldwide, the case for projecting global military power is weaker. Indeed, to date, China as a superpower seems uniquely uninterested in foreign military entanglements. The growth of China's economy is quite impressive. It now leads the world in the number of homeowners, internet users, college graduates, and arguably billionaires. Yet the case for China's economic strength also has some holes in it. While China has an enormous population of 1.4 billion people, it is an aging population, which may drop by as much as half by the end of this century. Indeed, it's projected that India's population will surpass China's by 2030. Further, one can detect that the Chinese people want more than just economic growth. They seek cleaner air, safer food and medicine, better health care and schools, less corruption, and greater equality. Moreover, these days, China's economic model is looking rather shaky, given the collapse of its real estate and construction industries and its relatively anemic growth figures. One might particularly note that while the United States and the European Union at present are raising interest rates so as to cool down explosive economies, China's central banks are actually lowering their interest rates in an effort to get China's economy going. Predictions that China's economy would someday become the world's largest are being heard less frequently. I suppose my principal claim in this lecture is that if there is some kind of new Cold War, it is not of the type we experienced prior to 1990. The Cold War of today is best understood as a conflict between states that favor liberal democracy and states that favor authoritarianism. Thus, arguably, the United States and its allies are not in a Cold War with Russia or China or the two of those countries together, but are in a protracted conflict with all states whose organizing principles are anathema to liberal democracies. As a general matter, those principles are centralization of power to preserve the status quo, rejection of political plurality, control of the media, manipulation of information, and reduction, if not elimination, of the rule of law, separation of powers, and democratic voting. While it had been thought that authoritarian repression was incompatible with capitalism, it now appears that that might not be the case. Some autocratic regimes, most notably China, have been able to develop their economies so as to embrace entrepreneurship and innovation, but without democratization. A recent report from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, looking at a very large data set on democracy for a project that involves some 3,700 scholars, concluded that the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen is now back down to 1989 levels. In other words, the democratic advances that were seen worldwide during the 1990s and early 2000s have now been eradicated. Liberal democracies, according to this report, peaked in 2012, and authoritarian regimes are now on the rise. The trend lines are there. Freedom House maintains that from 2006 to 2018, 113 states had a net decline in political rights and civil liberties, while only 62 experienced a net improvement. Moreover, and of particular importance for this conference, these authoritarian states are not just focused on repression at home. They are engaging in what we might call transnational authoritarianism, whereby they pursue repression, election interference, and censorship beyond their borders, and sometimes proxy wars, such as in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Unfortunately, analyzing this new Cold War between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes is complicated for at least 3 reasons. First, there is no clearly defined geographic element to this new Cold War. It can't be characterized as East versus West or North versus South or in some other convenient way. Further, there's no clearly defined political ideology driving this new Cold War. Such regimes cannot be characterized as arising from either the left or the right. Rather, authoritarian regimes can, for example, be either communist or fascist in nature. A second complication is that while there are some states that are reliably viewed as a liberal democracy and other states that are reliably viewed as an authoritarian regime, there are also states that might be described as a hybrid regime. Moreover, there are still other states that may oscillate over time between being a liberal democracy and an authoritarian regime. Consequently, the two camps are not entirely distinct nor entirely static in nature, such that the policies and tactics for addressing this new Cold War must regularly be recalculated. Even so, this is likely a protracted confrontation between two very different approaches as to how states should govern themselves. A third complication is that the United States, an enormously consequential country for addressing global peace, security, and justice, is itself confronting internally a battle between liberal democratic forces and authoritarian tendencies. False beliefs about the rigging of elections, laws making it harder to vote, precinct-level recruiting of persons primed to challenge voting, disinformation on social media platforms, deep political polarization, a disconnect between public opinion and governmental power. All of these are ingredients for the potential demise of representative government. 2 weeks ago, the Carnegie Endowment issued a report finding that every major international entity engaged in measuring democracy sees the United States in serious decline. For our purposes today, the important question may be, what are the consequences for international law of this new Cold War between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes? As a general matter, international law is not designed to dictate to states how their governments should be organized. But this new Cold War will both influence and be influenced by international law. Given the limited time I have, I'm just going to touch on 3 areas of international law in this regard. First, the maintenance of peace and security. The good news might be that a struggle between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes does not necessarily bode poorly for the maintenance of peace and security. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not inescapably the product of its autocracy, and most other authoritarian regimes do not seem supportive of Russia's invasion. Indeed, although perceived as an ally of Russia, China has consistently called for an immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine and a return to dialogue and diplomacy. So there should be space for cooperation between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes in this domain. Taking just one element of that cooperation, we have a tendency to look at the Security Council as consistently being involved in deadlocks. But notwithstanding this new Cold War, there seems to be a remarkable amount of dialogue and cooperation that does regularly occur within the Security Council. To take just this week alone, the Security Council has met, either formally or informally, to have an interactive dialogue on humanitarian aid to Syria, a separate briefing on Syrian chemical weapons, consultations on unrest in Haiti at China's request, briefings on Ethiopia, Palestine, and the DRC, including briefings involving civil society representatives, renewal of authorizations to intercept vessels off the coast of Libya suspected of migrant smuggling, and negotiation of a draft resolution on Myanmar. In short, despite Ukraine, peacekeeping missions in Africa are being renewed. Resolutions on UN assistance to Afghanistan and Somalia are being adopted, and so on. Having said that, the Council's ability to maintain peace and security worldwide has always been a glass less than half full, and that seems likely to continue in the future. Concerns with paralysis at the Council in the wake of Russia's invasion led to that resolution by the UN General Assembly in April of this year, saying that it would meet within 10 days after the casting of any veto by a Security Council member so as to debate in the General Assembly the situation at hand. Such efforts at reform are likely to continue and are the topic to be discussed during our second panel. A second area of international law to consider is human rights law. In short, this Cold War, this new Cold War, does not bode well for the protection of human rights. A defining feature of authoritarian regimes is the deprivation of civil and political rights. So there will continue to be a difficult struggle to promote those rights vis-a-vis those regimes. To an extent, the rise of authoritarian regimes in various countries is being fueled by sentiments against protection of minorities and refugees who are perceived as threatening the status quo. This new Cold War will continue to impede the functioning of the human rights bodies, such as the Human Rights Council, and the effectiveness of the human rights committees. Moreover, egregious human rights abuses occurring within authoritarian states will at times constitute crimes against humanity and genocide, providing ample work for the International Criminal Court in matters over which it has jurisdiction. But a key question is whether our existing international courts and tribunals are up to this task or whether changes are necessary. And our fourth panel today will tackle that issue. At the same time, authoritarian regimes are on weak grounds when it comes to human rights. Human rights directly challenges what those regimes are all about. And so a related issue concerns non-forcible transboundary intervention by one state in the domestic affairs of another state, especially since the struggle between those favoring liberal democracy and those favoring autocracy is happening between factions within states. An important question is to what extent it's permissible to engage in foreign support for one or the other of those factions. So consider, for example, the protests occurring in Iran today, which are the most significant that we've seen for at least a decade. What can liberal democracies do, consistent with international law, to assist those protesters? I note that the Biden administration recently authorized U.S. technology companies to offer communication services and satellite equipment to the protesters in Iran without any risk of violating U.S. sanctions. Is that permissible? Conversely, what constitutes impermissible intervention, such as a disinformation campaign intended to disrupt a foreign election or popular movements? Our third panel today will consider information operations and the new Cold War. A third area, and this will be the last, of international law to consider lies in the economic sphere. A unique aspect of this new Cold War is the economic entanglement of liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes. With some exceptions, such as North Korea, global trade and investment is rather strong between the two camps. Whether that entanglement can endure may turn on the efficacy of international law. Interestingly, in the area of trade law, authoritarian regimes at times are seen as the more law compliant. They call for the observance of neutral trade rules without regard to their effects on labor rights or environmental harms. In contrast, liberal democracies often seek to use economic sanctions and other trade restrictions to influence authoritarian regimes to do better, both internally and in relation to others. Indeed, the concepts of obligations erga omnes and permissible countermeasures may be increasingly tested in the years to come as liberal democracies seek to use trade sanctions to address authoritarian regimes. Further, given the fears that authoritarian regimes may use economic threats to achieve political goals, one might predict continued and increased invocation by liberal democracies of trade law exceptions, so as to allow actions deemed necessary for the protection of their essential security interests. Private transnational activity will be affected by government gamesmanship in this new Cold War. Companies are increasingly realizing that it is risky to rely on states with authoritarian regimes, given that those regimes can be unstable and unpredictable and may use their economic power for political purposes. This is most obviously seen in Europe's newfound recognition that dependency on Russian natural gas was a colossal mistake, but also can be seen in the pullout of hundreds of companies from Russia: Adidas, Starbucks, Shell Oil, Netflix, the list goes on. The Russian scenario has also prompted many companies to begin relocating production outside of China, notably in Southeast Asia. But it's not just those two countries. The economic and security interests or risks of globalization are being felt across the board. Indeed, the recently enacted CHIPS and Science Act by the United States, which essentially subsidizes U.S. production of semiconductors, reflects an understanding that global economic integration is not optimal if critical industries are located dominantly or exclusively in the territory of authoritarian regimes. Such developments will no doubt shape the nature and scope of future trade and investment agreements and the continued feasibility of existing ones. So, to conclude, a new Cold War? Maybe, but if so, I think it's a battle between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes, being fought out transnationally, but also within states. And the battlefield is not just warlike, it's also being fought through the internet, through economic relationships, and in myriad other ways. This, I think, is the critical challenge for international law in this century. Thanks for your attention.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah, my pleasure.
So thank you, Sean. That was a really thoughtful and insightful beginning to our conference. We are on schedule, so we like to take breaks so people get to mingle and get to rekindle their friendships in the hallways. We have until 8:45 or 9:45, and then we're going to have our next panel, the role of international law in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So take a couple of minute break, and we'll start right at 9:45.